Could you explain exactly how the whole rent situation worked and how that was improper?
What we know from the evidence is that there was a specific agreement between Gutierrez and Jennings and former attorney Marc Dann that they did not have enough income from their public role to afford their living expenses in Columbus. And I think, in fact, you heard that statement from counsel for Mr. Jennings today, that he asked for an increase in his salary. And instead of getting an increase in his public salary, he was given transition funds in the payment of his rent. That's the problem with this case, and it's a serious problem because the public expects that public officials are paid out of the public treasury, not from some third-party source where divided loyalties in the performance of duties would be expected. And I think this whole situation is a classic example of that outcome.
Is this a problem for Marc Dann as well, since he lived there for a time?
Well, the investigation's ongoing and continues to be, and we expect full cooperation of all the parties that have entered pleas or have been found guilty by the court at this point in time. And we've made the prosecutor informed of all the facts in our investigation. We're working jointly with the prosecutor, so we'll see what the final outcome of the case is.
How many days, a month, or a week do you think each of the three of them lived there? Do you know?
I think we know from the facts how long they lived in the apartment through December of, I believe, January of 08, maybe. We'd have to go back and look and answer the questions. The investigative report will answer that question now. Marc Dann himself moved out of the Tuttle complex, I believe, in November of that year, and I just don't remember whether it's 07 or 08. So they lived all the period of time that they were in public service, and that's part of the underlying problem in this case, is that the payments from the transition account and other monies weren't made in anticipation of service that had already been performed. They were made to offset the cost of the living expenses of the two there. And Jennings both received some of those payments and also authorized through direction back to the account the payments for Gutierrez overall.
So he just told us a second ago that, hey, I earned the money and I did everything that I was supposed to. I just basically made a clerical error in terms of receiving money at a time when I shouldn't have. Do you see it differently?
Well, I think his counsel saw it differently. His counsel in the courtroom said that he asked for an increase in salary, wasn't given it, and they gave him payments out of the transition account instead. Now, whether he earned money for the transition account that he justified that receipt of income for or not, I don't know. That's in Jennings' mind, not in our mind. But it was clear that he had an agreement with the Attorney General, as did Gutierrez, that the Attorney General would find a way to offset their living costs as public officials in the state of Ohio. And for senior officials in the state earning six-figure salaries, I think most citizens would expect that would be enough to pay them for their public service and their public duties.
What were the charges that were not pursued today?
As you heard, there were other additional non-disclosure counts that weren't pursued. There's other evidence of potential misconduct that is I would say, not clear-cut or not as specifically supported by the evidence, but that we're still pursuing with regards to others, and they're supporting that investigation as it goes on.
But the agreement is that these two people will never face charges related to those?
At least to the evidence that we know at the present time. And if there's some other additional discovery from the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office or our office from grand jury subpoenas that have been issued, then that's a different course of issue.
I guess the big picture is your feeling about how they were using this transition account and the Danforth, Ohio account. Was it sort of like a personal bank account for them?
I think it was a personal piggy bank. And for a long time in Ohio, public officials used money that was given to them after their election to their first day of service to pay for expenses in between. In this case, the transition account, without any transparency, without any disclosure, was used as a personal piggyback to pay loans for Mr. Gutierrez, his commercial loans, to pay living costs for the two of them in their public service, and for other payments that there was no ability of the public or you to know about.
There was some question when this first came up as to what you could and could not do with a transition fund. Are you clear now as to what transition funds can and cannot be used for?
Well, there's legislation pending in the Ohio legislature that has changed in different forms, but is an attempt to both regulate the transition account and authorize what it can be used for overall. But clearly at this time, there were no controls on the transition account. The controls were on the backside under the ethics law and related statutes that regardless of the source of the payment, it was still improper.
These were pleas, of course. How difficult would it be to get a guilty verdict on a transition-only charge?
Well, again, it isn't a question of the regulation of the transition account during this time period. It's the question of the regulation on the public officials and what they could do and what they could authorize and what they could pay and what they could receive. And that's why these folks are here, Mr. Gutierrez, as well as, and you remember there were other felony counts involving Mr. Gutierrez. But these folks are here because of the lack of transparency and disclosure of income. And by the way, we've got some folks here that have been prior press reporters who challenged public officials for their misconduct in their tenure and did not disclose their own income to the public in their public role. And so this is a clear case of, in the Ethics Commission's view and the prosecutor's view, of abuse of the public trust in public role and transparency and getting payment for the performance of public duties that is not allowed, is authorized, is illegal. That statute, by the way, has a 7-year removal from public office and public employment as a sanction. So Mr. Jennings cannot serve in public employment or public office in the state of Ohio for 7 years as a result.
I'm sorry, can you say your name?
David Freel. I'm the director of the Ethics Commission.
Thank you.
You're welcome. These payments have been cleared by in-house counsel. I believe when the final investigation is done, you will find in-house counsel did not know of any agreement between the parties that the payments would be used to offset their living expenses in lieu of public salary.
Are you suggesting that Mr. Jennings was lying, or that?
I'm just suggesting that the argument or justification that in-house legal counsel somehow authorized these payments was not fully informed. That the agreement that the payments would be made as part of an offset or an increase in public salary was not part of that discussion.
When do you think the transcript will be available?
The report itself? Probably later on this afternoon, we hope, in terms of final redactions. As you can imagine, a lot of the information is bank account specific, so we have to go back and redact those specific numbers and account numbers.
And there was a little bit of noise when he was announcing the sentence for Leo. Was it 60 days?
It was 300, I believe, Paul. 365, 360 days in jail? 360. 60? 60. I thought it was 360, but maybe.
There was noise.
Yeah, I was 60.
I thought it was 360.
Yeah,
What I thought.
I thought 360 suspended for the conditions of probation, but you'll have to check the journal entry on that.
And they were fined, both of them were fined $1,000 on each count.
That's exactly right.
And
now for Simpson, it's only one count, so it was $1,000 total for him. For Jennings, it was $2,000 in total.
And then what about community service? What did
It was 250 hours of community service.
for both of them, for each of them?
Just for Jennings.
Jennings. Simpson didn't get any community
Simpson was
service.
just
He just $1,000 fine and court costs.
Okay.
No probation or anything else.